It's time now for World Watchers International with Mae Brussell, who for over 17 years has investigated and exposed political conspiracies worldwide. World Watchers International originates at KLRB, Carmel, California. Here's Mae.
Good evening. This is Mae Brussell in Carmel, California. It's broadcast number 523. December the 13th, 1981. There are a few items in the news I want to just mention briefly and maybe get back to them in detail later on. A few stories about deaths, threats against the police chief investigating the Eugene Tafoya charges in Fort Collins, Colorado. He was convicted of attempting to murder a fellow from Libya. And two people from the CIA, attorney Jerry Johnson and Barbara Pollack, two attorneys, threatened the police chief in Fort Collins. They said, "You've gone too far, back off from the investigation." And the CIA was threatening Ray Martinez, the police detective on the case. They wanted to stop the links of the CIA to this particular murder or attempted murder charge, but they were threatening the police detective. There was a long article in the Los Angeles Times this week, another one on Samuel Cummings, always an important character. The article describes the world's #1 dealer in arms, and it tells how he is the brother-in-law of Senator John Tower, chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee, the man who sells the most arms privately to countries and individuals all over the world. Is in London. He worked for the CIA and still does. He's in London, and the brother-in-law of Senator John Tower. I just wanted to update the Hearst story. Patty Hearst was on television this week, and there were articles in the newspaper this week that the Hearst family paid $300,000 settlement to the husband of Myrna Opsahi, O-P-S-A-H-I. That woman was pregnant, the mother's 4 small children, and she was murdered in front of the Crocker Bank in Carmichael, California in 1975, and the Hearst family paid $300,000, or the great bulk of that, for the settlement in this case. And also the U.S. Attorney James Browning said that at the time of the prosecutions of the SLA, he had enough information to indict Jack Scott, who took Patty Hearst and the Harrises to New York and Pennsylvania. But Jimmy Carter, the president, told him the Justice Department should not proceed with the convictions. I'll update those later. I really want to get on to part 2 on the John Lennon murder, but I wrote about the SLA as the CIA, and now pieces of information are coming out that would confirm my early allegations, and the U.S. attorney is speaking, and also in Patty's book she tells of her relationship with the Harrises. I just can't resist, before I get on to the Lennon story again, or the murder of John Lennon, to run down the news of that Libya hit team that Ronald Reagan is trying to push on us, because it's so sad that it does require a few words just to show the kind of confrontation that Ronald Reagan and Alexander Haig want to put up, and how they can cause so many people to be disarranged and move back from Libya. On December the 3rd, Ronald Reagan, these are the headline stories, Reagan can't dismiss the Libyan threat. December the 4th, Libyan hitmen land in the United States to kill Reagan. December the 5th, the Libya assassin squad arouses concern in the White House. Tight security for Reagan aides. December the 7th, U.S. report on Libya hit squad is doubted. This is the Washington Post. Another headline, Gaddafi sees himself as the target, and then Gaddafi, no plot to kill Reagan. December the 8th, the United States has evidence of a Gaddafi plot. The president says he has proof of the plot. December the 9th, the notorious killer tied to the hit team. And that's what really grabbed me during this week, when they brought out old Carlos the Jackal. And I'll go into that in a second, because for the last 2 or 3 years, I've been talking about the links of Carlos to the Central Intelligence Agency. Jack Anderson has written about his protection by the agency, his links to that same Samuel Cummings, the arms merchant in London, his links to Frank Turple and George Corcola and Edwin Wilson and all of the CIA people who've made the headlines for so long. And all of a sudden they leave out from the news any links of Carlos to the CIA. and make him a notorious leftist terrorist from the Soviet Union and from Gaddafi. Now, the pathetic thing about this is if the CIA trained Carlos the Jackal, and at that time period George Bush was director of the CIA, then the CIA, if these stories were true, is coming back to kill Ronald Reagan because they couldn't do it in March of 1981. The stories about Carlos and his past leave out any link to all the headlines and stories of the past 2 years of Carlos to the CIA-trained teams. The December 9th article's headlines went on, Libyan hit squad, it doesn't wash. Some papers were doubting it. U.S. warns Gaddafi to drop his plot. Libya labels assassin reports the product of the CIA fantasy farm. December the 10th, attacks on Gaddafi backfire in the Middle East. We're losing our credibility in a few more countries. December the 11th, Americans in Libya say they feel safe there. They said today, I think it was today, they feel more safe there than in the United States. Headline, Soviet forces mass for Libyan maneuvers. Another one, Mexican border watch intensifies. Another one, Mr. Edwin Meese in San Francisco says, we can't ignore Gaddafi. Another headline that same day, Americans urged to leave Libya, and then, of course, they were forced to leave. December the 12th, leave Libya, Reagan says. OPEC spurns the Libya's anti-U.S. move. Another headline, the border alerted for Carlos. Another one, Israel said to be the major source of the Libyan hit team. With our $22 billion CIA budget and their franchise businesses, the CIA didn't have any information. Now they're blaming Israel for giving the information. They'll be the fall guy that they said Carlos was here. And then December the 13th, today, Libya's Gaddafi may be erratic, but he's no madman or a pushover. And another article that the Europeans are dealing with Libya the same as before. And it goes on to explain that London is sending workers to the oil fields if the United States is forcing them to come home. On Saturday Night Live, they said that Ronald Reagan is bringing home the people who are living in Libya, and they're sending the airport control tower people over to work in the oil fields, and he's going to put them on the job, those 1,200. That was pretty funny. Ronald Reagan, last week I talked about some of his problems in the White House besides this terrible Carlos the Jackal who's after him, and we'll go into his cabinet just briefly because he does have his problems, and I mentioned a few of them. One of them, the U.S. still continuing probe of CIA chief. It's underway. This is December the 12th. William Casey didn't tell the countries that he represented as a lobbyist for these various countries at his confirmation hearings, and the companies he represented. The Justice Department is still looking into CIA Director William Casey. Donovan probe is confirmed by White House. Links of Secretary of Labor Raymond Donovan to bribery by union officials. Reagan's group made a $1 million error in their financing. This was a Associated Press story this week. There was a bookkeeping mistake on the money they had, but the Federal Elections Committee won't make them return it. He got over $1 million more than he accounted for or said he got. Another headline, a big story, Reagan switched to macaroni. If you write to the White House and want a recipe, the First Lady used to give out her favorite recipe with crab, but people thought that was too expensive. So if you write now, you get a recipe for macaroni. Lenore Annenberg is leaving. She's chief of protocol, New York Times. She's going back to her husband. She misses him, but she's wounded by reports that she's bungling things, and she's the lady who arranged that Middle East funeral trip with Gerald Ford and Jimmy Carter and Richard Nixon at the time Sadat was murdered. Another story, Reagan finance aide wants the dismissal of William Niskanen, Niskanen. He's one of the financial advisors for Ronald Reagan, and Senate Budget Director Pete Domenici wants him out. He is making statements about finances, inflation that have no truth, and they're asking for his removal. And, of course, we heard part of John Ehrlichman's book this week, The White House, Nixon accused of racial bias. He said, regard to blacks, we should still do what we could for them within reasonable limits because it's right to do so, but they're genetically inferior to whites. This was part of his conversation. And, of course, Alexander Haig, a big headline this week. Haig wants joint action on Cuba, and then the headline says he cites Nicaragua as a threat to peace. Haig is jumping all over the globe. He was on his way to Israel and for the trying to get that Middle East peace settlement going, and he's got one foot into Poland. I won't even spend time on that right now. He would like to start a war around Cuba, Nicaragua, and also Libya at the same time. They're so crazy, they're acting almost like drunkards that it's hard to take them seriously. It's hard to know where they'll strike first, but they seem just to be like a temper tantrum, wanting to strike out at a lot of countries, including Grenada, and he has a foot in all the pies. Just any little war will satisfy him, and that will have them in control. So they kind of make a statement in one country, and then they're pulled out, and today it's Poland, and last week it was Libya, and the headlines are in Poland today. Last week I talked on the anniversary of the death of John Lennon when I called Part 1, the assassination teams from President Kennedy to John Lennon. In order to understand who murdered John Lennon, you have to go back into history of the characters who wanted him out of this country, who disliked rock music, who compare rock music to Satan, and particularly the politics of John Lennon and the amount of people that he could recruit for peace demonstrations or just the idea of peace. I talked about a little bit about Richard Allen's Japanese connections, and I'm going into more of that because the role of Richard Allen to Fred Fielding to the Japanese mafia to Robert Vesco, the American mafia, and organized crime, because the mafia are the hit teams, is very important, and Richard Allen's name is in the news so much that it's important to bring it up to date and relate it to what John Lennon was doing or Mark David Chapman was doing, and interweave the dates of where they touched bases with each other. And I'll do that as best I can by just going into Richard Allen this evening so that maybe you can get some view of who he is, and then put Chapman and John Lennon into that time slot, some of it later and some as I go along. Incidentally, in Maryland, of all places, probably near the CIA headquarters at Landover, Maryland, there was a murder right outside the Rolling Stones concert this week. They couldn't pull another Altamont, but a fellow went to the concert, and he was told by his mother, please don't go out there. She told the Associated Press, it's too dangerous. People always get hurt at those Stones concerts. And he said, oh, Ma, don't worry. And wouldn't you know that he went to the event and he got a gunshot wound outside, and they took him off to the hospital. He was dead. And, of course, the mother had the last word. Don't you always know they get killed at the Stones concerts? I think that these things have a tremendous effect upon people, psychological effect, and I truthfully believe they're manipulated, and that nobody's going to walk up to somebody and just shoot them outside a concert. And then it gets the wire services, and it goes on and on how dangerous it is to attend these concerts. What they didn't have in the newspaper this week, and I heard on the radio, was that Mick Jagger was almost killed in a head-on car crash, that he survived that and then canceled the next concert, that he was in upstate New York and was in a crash. But you don't get much in the newspaper about how they're almost killed or killed, but you get articles about how damaging they are as musicians. Well, now getting to Richard Allen and who he is and some stories about him that I think that are very important. Richard Allen went to Notre Dame University and got a BA and MA 1957, 1958, and I think I mentioned last week that he worked for the Helm Foundation, which was described simply as a study group that has to be an intelligence training period from 1958 to 1960. And in almost every single biography of an intelligence person or person suspected of working for Army or Navy intelligence or the CIA, there's what I call the missing 2 years that are unaccountable where they get their training. And many times you've heard me refer to those 2 years out of their chronology. Well, whatever the Helm Foundation was, he was with it from 1958 to 1960. And then he goes to Germany 1960 to 61 in Munich, where he works allegedly on a doctorate, but doesn't come home with a doctorate. But that is the same time period where Otto von Bolschwing, who under the cloak of ITT and Warner Lambert, the Republican Party and the Gehlen operation, working with Adolf Hitler's SS and the CIA, von Bolschwing comes to this country and then gets a lot of money and backing and goes back to Germany to route up a lot of money for the Gehlen operation that will be used in this country, noticeably is when John Kennedy was murdered, and then for other assassinations after that. So he goes to Germany at the same time that von Bolschwing is over there, and he allegedly is getting a doctor's degree, but he comes home without it. So this could have been 2 more years of training with Hitler's chief of intelligence, Reinhard Gehlen. Because later, when I go into the Japanese connection of Richard Allen, one of his close contacts was with a Japanese war criminal who was released, Okanori Kaya, Kaya, who was part of the Japanese war crime group, convicted or listed as one of the most important war criminals, who then meets with Mr. Allen and has a long relationship with Takeo Fukuda, who became the prime minister of Japan and was part of a Fukuda group. I guess you could compare them to the Barry Goldwater, the far, far right, behind the scenes, manipulative relationship. And Fukuda and Takase, the gentleman who sets up that alleged photographic interview with Nancy Reagan, but it's much deeper, and we'll go into that. Richard Allen is working with people who were involved with war crimes, just as von Bolschwing was also with Adolf Eichmann. So his tentacles go to the very deepest fascist links of both German and Japanese intelligence from Hitler's intelligence operation. So he has 2 years from 59 to 60 that, or 58 to 60 that really have no description in biographies that I can find yet, but we'll fill in later. And then from 60 and 61 in Germany. And then he comes back to the United States, to Georgia Tech, and becomes an assistant professor. Well, there's not much money in being assistant professor, and he didn't even have a PhD. So it'd be interesting to know what his expertise was, what he taught, or whether that also is a cover, because down in Georgia, this was the time of the Bay of Pigs and CIA operation in Georgia and Lockheed, that he would later become strongly affiliated with Lockheed, which under the guise of Howard Hughes and Lockheed set up assassination teams that Allen later is directly linked into. So what he taught came back from Germany, what he taught at the University of Georgia Tech, I don't know. But after Georgia Tech, in 1962, he becomes the founder and the senior staffer of Georgetown Center for Strategic and International Studies. And I've mentioned this group. Out of there comes Gene Kirkpatrick and the Richard Mellon Scaife operation, and people like Borschgrave, who wrote The Spike, and the far right-wing literature that is coming out of Georgetown, the CIA front, the Defense Department front, the group that Henry Kissinger was sent to from Harvard to work with out of a really non-existent profession. How could he become the founder of the senior Georgetown and be a senior staffer of Georgetown Center for Strategic International Studies? I think this is important because that Center for Strategic and International Studies would possibly, or probably, or I should say, was then founded by the same man behind Adolf Eichmann, this Otto von Bolschwing, and Reinhard Gehlen. If Gehlen could come from Hitler's Germany in 1945 and set up our National Security Council and our CIA, Richard Allen later becomes the director of the National Security Council with his fuzzy background, and absolutely how would he have the funding, and where did the funds come from that started this particular study group that was ready, founded in 1962, the year before John Kennedy was murdered and was ready to control our government, certainly politically and strategically, as soon as John Kennedy was murdered and the framework was set for the other political assassinations. They would be able to flow in when a person like Ronald Reagan came to power or Richard Nixon in 1968 and be their advisors. And from Georgetown University, where he comes back from Europe and Germany, and as this large amount of money is being raised by von Bolschwing and the Galen operation, he goes in 1966 to the Hoover Institute on War, Revolution, and Peace. It's more about war than peace. In Palo Alto, Stanford, and gets his strong anti-communist, anti-D'Entente training. Now, it's while he's at Stanford University that he meets Mr. Takase, his Japanese friend, and Takase is the link between the Japanese war criminals and the major industries, the automobile and the energy, and various dummy fronts. It could be military intelligence or Japanese mafia, later in Japan. It's at the Hoover Institute that he meets Mr. Takase. Then Takase goes home to Japan, and the wheels start rolling for Allen and his Japanese contacts over there. Takase is sent by this clique of the far-right Japanese people that had invaded, bombed us at Pearl Harbor, made allies with Nazi Germany, and so forth. And Mr. Takase is over from Japan in Palo Alto from 1966. That's where he meets with Richard Allen, and they have several years there where they're training together and learning about war, particularly war. Now, in San Francisco in 1966, August 29th, at the exact time that Richard Allen, with unknown funds or background, is at the Hoover Institute with Mr. Takase, the Lennons, John Lennon and the Beatles give their last concert in San Francisco, August the 29th, 1966. We attended that concert. We took all of our children and were there that evening when they flew out of Candlestick Park in San Francisco, and that was the last time the Beatles were together. And about 20 miles below Candlestick Park, or 30 miles, I forget now, I should know, I went to Stanford, is the Hoover Institute, and that's where Takase and Allen were meeting. 1966 was the last concert of the Beatles, and also in 1966, John Lennon met Yoko Ono. Her name was Cox at the time, C-O-X. She was divorced or separated from her husband. He met her, Yoko Ono, whose family is an interesting family. I don't have too much on them. They're very wealthy, almost as wealthy as the Beatles, into ammunition and armament in Japan. Yoko Ono from Japan meets John Lennon. The Beatles have their last concert at Candlestick Park, and at this time Spiro Agnew joins Richard Nixon's campaign, and Richard Allen also joins Richard Nixon as the advisor and director of foreign policy. Richard Nixon's going to run for president in 1968, and Thane Caesar from Lockheed, again from Lockheed, because Mr. Allen is very heavily involved with Lockheed pretty soon. Thane Caesar shoots Robert Kennedy from the back of the head. He's a security guard from Lockheed. And in 1968, the man running against Richard Nixon will be out of the way and dead, and they'll have their convention in 1968. Robert Kennedy was killed in June 68, and if there were a decent Democrat, they would have demanded that the elections be called off until they find out who killed Robert Kennedy, and we never would have had Richard Nixon or Ronald Reagan if we had done this. In 1968, Richard Allen was accused of sending signals, covert signals, to Vietnam, and this was along with Madame Chennault and others, to go slow on the war. Don't end the war so quickly, because when Richard Nixon had a campaign issue later, it would be good to wind down the war in Vietnam. He was accused of interfering with peace and tampering with peace during this time period so that they would have some issue to beat the Democratic candidates later. That also involves Spiro Agnew and, as I say, Madame Chennault and other people. And in 1968, when Richard Nixon was president, he appointed Richard Allen to be the senior staff member, not the chief of the National Security Council, but his senior staff member of the National Security Council from 1968 to 1969. That was the time period where John Lennon was busted. He had some binoculars at his house. There was marijuana in the binoculars. And in London, John Lennon was busted in 1968. And also in 1967, at the time that Richard Allen was joining the Richard Nixon campaign and so forth, and the Beatles had left California. They went back to London. In 1967, Brian Epstein, their manager, was killed in a car crash that literally demolished and broke up the Beatles emotionally at the time being. As I say, John met Yoko in 66. Their last concert was in 66. And in 67, their manager, who arranged so much for them, was killed in a car crash. Richard Allen was working for Richard Nixon. Robert Kennedy was killed, and we're on to 1968. By 1969, Richard Allen left that National Security Council appointment. Nixon was in 1 year, and he worked for the International Resources Limited, which could be a dummy front. Now, I don't really know what National Resources Limited is, Richard Allen, but his background so far is so vague that and what follows later with the connections that fill in, that it's a very good chance that International Resources Limited is like the Export-Import Bank being used by I.G. Farben and the Nazi intelligence, again, for spy systems. Now, in 1969 is when the Nugenhan Bank was started, that William Colby of the CIA would be set up with, and William Paisley had direct contact with. Paisley was involved in the murder of John Kennedy with Navy intelligence and Oswald in the Soviet Union. 1969, this bank began to be formed. It was a combination of heroin, traffic, cocaine, Southeast Asia drugs, the CIA, and the assassination teams, and money went from Southeast Asia and Laos and Cambodia into Australia to that particular bank. Henry Kissinger was a national security advisor. He was a protege of Fritz Kramer, another Nazi from Germany. Richard Allen wanted the job, but he didn't get it because he was too much of a hardliner for Richard Nixon. This is our national security advisor at the time. In 1979 is when Brian Jones died. He had been in the company of a man from California, a CIA man who brought drugs to the Rolling Stones, and he died in England in 1969. And in 1969 is when Mr. Takasi was working with Richard Allen. He had met him at the Hoover Institute, and now he's working with him to bring in textiles to the United States. In 1969, they're beginning their trade. In 1970, Richard Allen is working with the King Empire from Texas, oil, gas, and gas drillings. And John King was connected with stock fraud. Richard Allen's record wasn't so totally clean then, or Watergate or other times, but he gets himself out of these situations. The King family had to do with minerals, affiliated with minerals. And in 1970, he was a member of Richard Nixon's Presidential Commission on International Trade and Investment Policy. And then he sent to Japan to his friend, Mr. Takase, who shows up later with this bribe question that may pull him out of national security appointment, because it goes way beyond that. And he's working under the guise of Lockheed, and he's using Lockheed as a cover and Grumman airplanes. And at the time, with Lockheed, Edwin Wilson and Frank Churchill and Thane Caesar were working for Lockheed, as I say, through this time period. The Howard Hughes assassination teams were, with Robert Mayu, the hit teams of the CIA and organized crime, worked under Lockheed, and Mr. Richard Allen was working with these connections of Lockheed and Grumman. Earlier, 15 years before, he had met Takasi and at Stanford, and now they were operating at a different level, selling contracts for Grumman airplanes to Japan, and he was pressuring them 2 years later to donate $1 million to Nixon's campaign, and then Grumman would get airplane contracts, and then Allen would pressure the Japanese to buy the Grumman airplanes, give Richard Nixon $1 million, I'll get your airplane contracts from Japan. So Allen had a lot of clout with Japan, and he guaranteed them if they got their Nixon in, reelected, then they'd be sure to get the airplane contracts, because that's what the wars are about. They're not just there to move boundaries on the globe. They're to make money and so forth. September the 18th of 1970, Jimi Hendrix died in London. October the 3rd, 1970, Janis Joplin died in Los Angeles. In 1971, Jim Morrison died in Paris. The rock musicians were beginning to go. And in March 1971, Richard Allen made a trip to Japan. He worked for the White House plumbers, and Nixon called him in to help plug these leaks. In 1972, at the time of Watergate, he was getting contacts with Robert Vesco, and this is very important because of information of his contacts going back to the Watergate period with Robert Vesco, and how he leaves Richard Nixon and latches on to the Miami organized crime Vesco contacts for such a long period before he ends up again as our advisor to National Security Council. He is working, he has left Mr. King, he's back at the White House, he's deputy assistant to President Nixon again on international trade, and he's working also making deals in Japan with Richard Nixon. We'll take a 1-minute break, and we'll go back to Richard Allen, a very important person, I believe, to the John Lennon murder story.
This concludes the first half of World Watchers International with Mae Brussell. We will return with the second half after a brief pause.
Now, here we get to the scandalous assassination teams and the links to Richard Allen with his background in intelligence and from not only his past, but then on up to the present. At the time of Watergate, Richard Nixon was raising funds for his reelection, and Maurice Stans was helping him. And one of the people who didn't want to be criminally prosecuted for absconding with anywhere from $224 million to $500 million, Robert Vesco, allegedly gave $200,000 in $100 bills to Maurice Stans and John Mitchell. He wanted some special favors from them because of his white-collar crimes. And so in 1972, there was this transaction to the Republican Party of this, in the book, The Breaking of the President, a brilliant book on Watergate, on the section of white-collar crime. It describes Robert Vesco, the man accused of giving Nixon's campaign fund $200,000 illegal cash, all in $100 bills. He did so in an attempt to block the investigation of a Security Exchange Commission theft that he had. He had $224 million from stockholders from Investment Overseas Service, and Bernie Cornfeld said that it wasn't $224 million. We're talking about $500 million. You could only earmark $224 million. So Robert Vesco is floating around with $500 million in June of 1972. So Vesco doesn't miss a good opportunity. As a matter of fact, this William Casey, who's our CIA director, who worked with OSS and Reinhard Gehlen, Hitler's chief of intelligence, to form the CIA. William Casey is bringing in the money and is involved with Security Exchange Commission and John Mitchell. And John Mitchell takes this $200,000 cash, and they change the records and put JM instead of RV, Robert Vesco, so nobody will know where it came from. And then they destroyed other records and put a lot in the shredder and ordered that all the Vesco material be hidden. They were so anxious to grab the $200,000 in cash that they destroyed the records of this. But the point is that here was a man that had taken $224 to $500 million, and Richard Allen couldn't resist that. And so he left the Republican Party, the Richard Nixon administration, and I'm sure Nixon put him there so that Vesco and he could clean up any dirty loose ends that they needed to wipe up that would trail them to these various crimes that were about to be exposed. So June 17th in 1972 was the Watergate break, and by July 1972, Richard Allen resigns, 1 month after Watergate. And he goes down to Florida, and he forms Potomac International, or he forms a company called Potomac International. Well, where did he get the money for Potomac International? That's a good question. Allen and Vesco were very close in Georgia to Mitchell Werbel, the man who made the silencers and weapons for assassination hit teams all over the world and bragged about the murders of various people throughout the world. And, of course, it was down in DeKalb County in Werbel's country that Mark David Chapman resided and went to junior college, lived down there. His father still lives there. And in 1972, the same year that Richard Allen is going to get all this bread and try to link up with Vesco and get the Azore Islands for Vesco. After all, $500 million will get you a lot of islands. Or try at least in 1972 is when Mark David Chapman in Georgia from DeKalb County all of a sudden turns against John Lennon, resents the remarks that Lennon is as popular as Jesus. And it's that year that he becomes a Jesus freak down in DeKalb County. And that is the time in 1972 that the FBI first had reports of Chapman having an arrest record for an armed robbery, but they covered it. And then in 1972, when Allen is down there forming Potomac International, his public relations firm that's later bought over by Hannaford and Deaver, Richard Nixon's buddies, it was that time I mentioned last week where Strom Thurmond said, in quotes, "We have to take appropriate action. Appropriate action must be taken in time to get John Lennon. That this is the time we should take." That was 1972 when Chapman was down there in Georgia, in DeKalb, when Mitchell Werbel was working for Robert Vesco and Richard Allen, when Strom Thurmond wanted to get Lennon and other rock musicians, and I just mentioned 2 or 3, had already been killed, and there were many more, and managers also. Now, in 1973, Richard Allen is forming his company. He's doing work for international business exploring. He's creating an international financial center in the Caribbean. Where did he get his money? Was it Vesco? Is Vesco CIA? Does Vesco represent what Mayhew was, only the floating Mayhew? Yes, they all work together. Robert Mayhew was FBI, Army intelligence, used organized crime and the CIA for assassination hit squads. Vesco worked with the same people, wove in and out. We can do one whole hour more on Robert Vesco. But Allen leaves the White House and goes in to make his contacts with Vesco and also links up with William Casey, who is our director of the CIA at this time. And allegedly he has a company called Overseas Company in Portugal. He makes $60,000 a year representing them from 1973 to 74. And that's a front for 70 other companies. And it's that time when he's working for Portugal and trying to get the Azore Islands for Vesco that he covers up a mass murder in Mozambique and is using disinformation of the CIA to cover these crimes. He's active with his overseas companies in Portugal. In 1974, Robert Vesco is a consultant to Tokyo Electric Power Company, the largest utility company in Japan. He also is doing industrial research for another company in Japan. And in 1975 is when Mark David Chapman is at Beirut, Lebanon, sent there by a Tony Adams, a mysterious character, and then to Fort Chaffee, Arkansas, where he makes important connections at Fort Chaffee that are to send him to countries all over the world where Richard Allen and Robert Vesco and Turple and Wilson, Frank Turple and Edwin Wilson and the CIA have connections. Now, he represents various countries, and particularly Japan. He's very strong in Japan, and he has influence in Japan, and he uses it for, as I say, getting contracts to buy the Grumman airplanes and so forth. Now, in 1976, January 1976, is when he takes an apartment, Richard Allen, in Florida. He has 3 apartments in Florida, and this is very important because He buys them, or they're condominiums, but they are from the man who he worked with in arranging his original contacts for Robert Vesco and the Azore Islands. And he has these apartments down there that I'll go into detail in a minute more about those apartments. But one of them is with Fred Fielding, who was with Army Intelligence, who worked with John Dean in Nixon's White House, who deep-sixed. He was the one who went into E. Howard Hunt's safe and took out the Chappaquiddick papers, the story of the Pentagon papers, the going into Dr. Lewis Fielding's psychiatrist's office, the forging of the papers to say John Kennedy murdered DM. Fred Fielding of Army Intelligence is the attorney who worked with John Dean, who shares the apartment today with Richard Allen in Florida, and they started these condominiums. There's 3 of them. One, Fielding has 50% with Richard Allen. One condominium Allen owns totally, and the other Allen owns in a partnership and has not told anyone as of this day in Washington, D.C., or anybody who has these apartments. As I say, Fred Fielding was from Army Intelligence, and they bought their condominium from Viscount Jose Botello, who they worked with in the Azore Islands when they were establishing business contacts for Robert Vesco, and with this company that Allen had over in Portugal and the Azore, he also represented 70 other companies. Now, those 70 could be all franchises of IG Farben or ITT. We don't know what conglomerates or international organizations were there. But by 1976, Richard Allen purchased these apartments. Now, when he was confirmed as a national security chief, this administration, he said he owned an apartment in Florida. He never said who his partner was. The Fred Fielding, who cleared Richard Allen on this bribery charge, is the person he shares the apartment with. And he has never said who has the other apartment that he shares, and I'm sure that that person comes from the Defense Department or Navy Intelligence or organized crime. At his confirmation hearings, Richard Allen said that he sold Potomac International, which again began with some various mysterious funds during the time that he was in contact with Robert Vesco, who had those 224 to 500 million floating around and then linked with organized crime and narcotics traffic. They could recycle that 500 million a lot of times over. At his confirmation hearings, he said he sold Potomac International, that got its crazy start at the time he was in the big bucks with the super floating organized crime CIA figures. And then they discovered that he didn't sell it at all until 1980 when he became National Security Advisor. The Potomac International was purchased by Michael Deaver and Peter Hannaford. Those were people that took over their lobbyists for Taiwan, and I have a list of the corporations that they represent since Ronald Reagan is in office, including National Public Broadcasting that goes over to the FM radio stations, and I want to do more about that as I get to that point. But during this time period, Allen was setting introductions of Ronald Reagan in Japan to his friend Mr. Takase and to the Japanese war criminals. He was arranging these meetings so that Reagan would look like a man of the world. He was simply meeting some pretty tough buns like Okanora Kea, the Japanese war criminal, or Mr. Fukuda, the far, far right, and a whole nest of people that made Ronald Reagan look like a statesman and going to Japan, but Richard Allen was setting that trip up in 1978. In 1979, he was bringing over representatives of President of Datsun Motor. He works closely with the Datsun people, the Toyota people, at a time when our automobile industry is hurting so badly, and he brought them over to this country and introduced them to members of Congress. I think I mentioned this last week at this time period. Now, also during this time period of 1979, this is just before Ronald Reagan's elected president, Robert Vesco is working with Bobby Hall out in California. Bobby Hall was murdered, but the man who was in on the murder of Bobby Hall was a police chief in Beverly Hills named Jack Eggers. the man who drugged Howard Hughes at the bungalow at the Beverly Hills Hotel. And later I'll go into the Eggers, Vesco, Hollywood narcotic connections to the assassination teams. But in 1979, Michael Reagan, the son of Ronald Reagan, had suggested Jack Eggers, a man who was fired from the Beverly Hills Police Department because of his foreknowledge and his after-knowledge on the murder of Bobby Hall. Michael Reagan is recommending to Governor Brown that Jack Eggers be on a narcotics commission in California, and they brought this to Mike Kerb, and Brown turned down. There was a lot of controversy here, and Brown turned it down. But Michael Reagan was working with Jack Eggers, closely linked to Robert Vesco, a client of Bobby Hall's, and Howard Hughes, so that Ronald Reagan has tentacles that we'll go into later, that not only was Richard Allen messed up with Robert Vesco and all of the implications of using murders to get into the White House, killing John Kennedy and Robert Kennedy, making Nixon president, and then making way for Ronald Reagan. Reagan's son has contacts with these people. Richard Allen has contacts with them, and so forth. Richard Allen arranged in 1980 George Bush's visit to Japan. Bush was the head of the CIA, the director of CIA at the time of Watergate. He was ambassador to China, but Richard Allen was getting $100,000 a year from Nissan Motors at the time as a lobbyist for the Japanese motor company and so forth. So in 1980, Richard Allen was working very close with the Japanese motor companies, and he had clients over in Japan, and it went even farther than that. The Washington Post had a long story this week, Allen seen in Tokyo as the key link to the United States. Then the next part of the article describes his strong relationship with top Japanese officials. Allen's ties precious, Japanese say. That was one of the top stories there. And they go in, the Washington Post has a magnificent article by Tracy Dalby on Richard Allen's relationship between Japanese politicians. It goes into Mr. Takase, that he's a business consultant for him, and that Takase is the middle link between the Washington establishment. That's the man that called Richard Allen and said, set us up with Ronald Reagan. But of course, the Japanese newspapers, as I said last week, said the big payoff to Allen came 2 days before the inauguration on the 18th. Then they met with Reagan alone on the 19th, and the pictures of Nancy Reagan after the inauguration were just an afterthought. The relationship between Allen and Takase is very precious in the Japanese area, according to the Washington Post. He's important for the Takeo Fukuda group, the former Japanese prime minister who runs a Japanese parliament, and he used this group to promote his own consultation work. This article in the Washington Post goes into Mr. Keiya, that Okanori Keiya was convicted of being a Class A war criminal by the American occupation forces for his role in Japan's wartime cabinet. Keiya made a political comeback, like all our Nazis did, in the early 60s when he became pro-American, anti-communist, and it's still in vogue with the Japanese right-wing politicians. Every person from Japan, if they're far right, as long as they're anti-communist, that's okay. Mr. Takase met Richard Allen in the 1960s when both men worked at the Hoover Institute at Stanford University. As I said before, and this is from the Washington Post, and then after that introduction, Mr. Takase goes back to Japan and becomes the benefactor to Richard Allen. They used their Stanford Institute, the Institute on War, Peace, and Revolution, set up by the Tsarist Russians and by Adolf Hitler's German Nazis who came to this country and were very strongly linked to every level of our Defense Department and intelligence. After Takase and Richard Allen were together at Stanford, then Takase goes back and makes the contacts to Fukuda and Keiya and the strong Japanese group. In the past years, Allen and Takase are instrumental in arranging meetings between politicians, between the establishment figures. Takase and Allen arranged in March in the White House, just before Ronald Reagan was shot, one meeting between Fukuda, former prime minister who works hard with Richard Allen, and this is what they refer to as their pipeline of information. Well, with Allen's background in Germany, in Georgia, at Georgetown, and at the Hoover Institute before he becomes the advisor to Nixon after Robert Kennedy is wiped out, the pipeline could be also a pipeline to a lot of the assassination teams and intelligence operation going on. The Rockefellers set up the Trilateral Committee, which included a lot of the espionage operations and financial manipulations coming. One of the three countries was Japan. William Colby of the CIA retired to become a lobbyist and an agent for 5 to 7 Japanese companies. The Guggenheim Bank, with their narcotics traffic, had strong connections in Japan and in Tokyo. Mark David Chapman, who shot John Lennon, was in Tokyo in 1978 and in South Korea, and a lot of other countries, too, I might add. He was a well-traveled man who went to many, many countries, and but he was in Tokyo. And the woman who married Mark David Chapman when he came back from those trips is a Japanese woman, Japanese, born in Hawaii, her family, but family from Japan. And Yoko Ono is the mysterious Japanese woman who said this week that she is sending money inside the Soviet Union to break up the Iron Curtain countries. Let's see, I have the direct quote of Yoko. She wants you to pray for peace, but a lot of people believe that peace is when you finally defeat the Soviet Union. So I know you don't like me maybe to talk about Yoko Ono. This is Los Angeles Times, December the 7th. She says, let's not waste John's death. Use it as a springboard for sanity and peace. Think globally. Act locally, she said. She gave $20,000 to child abuse, $20,000 to drug rehabilitation, $10,000 to the City Police Athletic League, $25,000 to the New York Patrolmen Benevolent Association, $10,000 to the Salvation Army, and she gave American Civil Liberties Union, who also defend the Nazis heavily, and Amnesty International, but she doesn't mention some of the countries that Amnesty talked about. She's giving $35,000 at least for a project of musical exchange between the people of Western hemispheres and those behind the Iron Curtains, the countries controlled by dictatorships. Does she mention Argentina or Nicaragua or Guatemala or Paraguay or Uruguay or South Korea or the Philippines, Brazil, the Indians of Brazil, the Amazons or feudal systems? No. She's worried about the people behind the Iron Curtains, is Yoko Ono's anti-Russian definition of peace. Part of this operation, I'm asking the question, and you can fill in the answers in the years to come, as you have to when you think about the role of Jacqueline Onassis with Aristotle Onassis and how she's put down every person that wanted to investigate who did the murders. It was Yoko Ono, the Japanese wife of John Lennon, who immediately said one crazy man did it. That ends the case. She has the Spirit Foundation, but the money is going behind Iron Curtain countries controlled by dictatorships, and I don't see those other dictatorships that are prevalent everywhere mentioned by Yoko Ono. Richard Allen had 4 meetings in the White House with Takashi after Reagan was president. He set them up. Even though, as I say, our American Motor Company, car companies are having trouble. And I don't think he is so much a lobbyist for Datsun or Toyota. The car companies are also a cover for espionage. And I think Richard Allen's background has more to do with Mr. Takashi and payoffs and assassinations and the Guggenheim Bank and with William Colby and the Trilateral and our spies in Japan because of the organizations he works with there. Then it has to do with automobiles. The Washington Post says Allen uses Takashi's views for an analysis of Japanese political trends. What do you mean, the Japanese political trends? For one thing, they want to sell what they produce. They don't want to limit on what they make, and they want to compete in the open market. You can analyze in 5 minutes what their political trends are. He also worked with them on their opinions of Yasser Arafat's visit to Japan. Now, Richard Allen works very close with William Casey We heard and read everywhere that the CIA knew a month in advance and 2 days in advance that Sadat was going to be murdered. Sadat's murder came at a date they all knew. They could have told him to stay inside. At the time Sadat was murdered, Arafat was making his first formal head of state presentation in Japan, which now we see, according to the Washington Post, the links of Richard Allen, and also it must be William Casey of the CIA, if they knew in advance. Synchronized with Sadat's murder was the sending of Arafat to Japan, and then Miss Annenberg sending Richard Nixon and Jimmy Carter and Jerry Ford to the funeral of Sadat and using it as a symposium to praise Arafat, the PLO, and to ask for sending AWACS to Saudi Arabia. A lot of things were accomplished when Sadat was murdered, but the point is that Richard Allen's role as National Security Advisor, with all the expensive money that we have for defense intelligence agencies, CIA, Navy intelligence, and so forth, his links to Mr. Takasi and person-to-person at Blair House, or getting big gifts or little gifts or envelopes with 100,000 and so forth, or whether it's 1,000 in special safes. Mr. Allen is more involved with espionage, and there were a lot of connections that I'll go into, not only Allen's relationship to Japanese persons of intelligence, the spy system, but also the Japanese relationships to the murder of John Kennedy, as I say, Mark David Chapman in Tokyo, his Japanese wife, John Lennon's Japanese wife, who met him just at the very last concert the Beatles were to have in 1966. Now, Richard Allen kept up his Japanese contacts. They were very strong. He's kept them up to the present time. And he has been the middleman. They refer to him in the Washington Post as the middleman in the connections to the White House with Mr. Takasi. Now, in this relationship, Takasi and other fellow, what's his name? I got the Japanese names disconnected. I have to go back and look up the other three names. Mr. Fukuda. They don't use normal diplomatic channels. In the Washington Post, they said, why don't you use embassy meetings for these Mr. Fukuda and for Mr. Takasi? And the answer was, well, the embassy's too busy for day-to-day diplomatic affairs. They have no time to lay the groundwork. They don't want a direct approach because they might be rejected by Ronald Reagan. And they have loose ends to tie up, so they use intermediaries. Well, when they don't have official meetings and they come to this country like Takeo Fukuda and meet with Ronald Reagan, these little behind the scenes into the White House, the Blair House the day before the inauguration, the White House the day after the inauguration, have to be some kind of a transaction that the top dogs know about, and they're not ordinary political channels or the way that you do business. The Washington Post says this is an unobtrusive style of doing business, and it helps with political and business leaders to have individuals such as Richard Allen in direct line to the President of the United States. Well, you better bet your last bottom dollar it helps them to have direct line to the President of the United States, and it also helps the President of the United States not to have John Lennon around as he goes through these escapades, just in case Lennon got his senses and surfaced again and realized that we still don't have peace. Now, Takasi is professor at Kyoto Industrial University. He's a professor like Richard Allen, but the Washington Post says he uses his job at the university for politics and business. The university, like the Hoover Institute and so forth, must be covers for much bigger business that's going on. The Washington Post said his university position helps his business activities, and you can believe that one. Takasi is described as a greaser of wheels. Well, how greasy can Robert Vesco get with apartment that Richard Allen is using? And remember that Richard Allen left Richard Nixon in July of 72 when the ship was sinking, and Watergate break-in took place, and goes off with a nefarious Vesco with 6 contacts and flies around in his airplanes and meets with people trying to arrange little havens for Vesco. A man with 224 to 500 million bulging out of his pockets, and Richard Allen latches onto him, and Takasi from the old Stanford Hoover days, and the Japanese more sinister, besides the mafia, the more sinister, the far right wing, the Galen Nazi Japanese, the equivalent that worked closely with them. In the book, the Martin Bormann, Nazi in Exile, it tells about the Japanese, at the same time the Germans making sure that their money was out of Japan when the war was over so they could reinvest it and come back and work along with the Nazis as soon as the war was over. When they saw the war was losing, they took the money out of Japan, like the Germans took the money out of Germany, and along with our CIA, rebuilt Germany and Japan. And Richard Allen and William Casey were a strong part of that. I will continue next week on Richard Allen, I think, and also Mark David Chapman, and do maybe part 3 and 4 and 5 up till the beginning of the year to set the interlocking relationships of these people, of the assassination hit teams, the cities they worked in, the sources of their money, their nefarious connections. Because if you understand that background, you can see how easily John Lennon and other musicians could be wiped out. And again, Bobby Hall was involved with rock musicians, and Robert Vesco was his client. And we'll get to those later. I don't have time now, but that's enough to remember this week if you can remember all those names. In the meantime, you take care, and this is Mae Brussell in Carmel, California.
This has been World Watchers International with noted conspiracy investigator Mae Brussell. This program originates from Carmel, California.